This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, this weekly vlog series where I give some thoughts about the current limited format, which right now is Midnight Hunt. And in this video, I wanted to talk about the 10 color pairs and how good I think each of them are, where they sort of rank compared to one another. So basically, I'm ranking the archetypes in this video. I did do a whole video on the archetypes, an archetype guide, before the format came out, and a lot of what I had to say in that video stands up. I mean, certain things are better than I expected them to be or worse than I expected them to be, but the synergies are pretty much the same. And for that reason, I'm not going to go in depth about each of these archetypes. I'm just going to rank them and explain why I think each of them is pretty good. And I do also want to say, these archetype rankings are useful for helping you make decisions about picks, but don't ever, force an archetype because someone said it's the best color pair, and don't ever avoid an archetype because somebody said it's the worst color pair. Draft, what matters most is not what archetype you're drafting exactly. What matters is drafting what's open. And the worst archetype, when it's entirely open, can be really good. And the best archetype, if everybody's drafting it, can be terrible. So that's just a disclaimer about this. All right, so let's dive in. I have them divided into 3 tiers. And the first tier has 2 decks in it. One of them is blue-black zombies. And yeah, I think this is the best archetype in the format. The Signpost Uncommon is Blade Stitched Scob, a 2-mana 2/3 that pumps your zombies by +1/+0. And this color pair is all about zombies and taking advantage of the free zombie bodies you have tacked onto all sorts of reasonable effects, the 2/2 decay tokens. Take advantage of those by sacrificing them, or with tap effects like Siege Zombie. For each of these color pairs, I'm going to give you sort of a key common, a card that's at its best in this particular color pair, and a card that really embodies what it's about. And I'm also talking about the Signpost Uncommon briefly, of course, too. And Siege Zombie is exactly that for this deck. When I'm talking about these key commons, I'm not talking about cards that are just good in every deck. Diregraph Horde, going to be great in every deck, but it's also really good in this one. Siege Zombie, though, really going to be at its best here because you're going to be making lots of zombies. It's amazing how quickly you can populate the board in this format. There's just a lot of commons that just give you free zombie tokens on top of a very real effect, and it doesn't quite feel like a 2-for-1, but a zombie token's worth like half a card in a blue-black deck that's well constructed. And I think this is the best archetype because the synergy's really not that hard to make happen. It just sort of happens if you draft blue-black, and it's the color pair that comes together the easiest, and that's usually what makes an archetype the best. The next archetype I have in this first tier is blue-white, and it's also the only other one I have in this first tier. I think these 2 archetypes are the best by a significant margin. And blue-white is really nice because you have access to all this Disturb stuff. Devoted Graph Keeper is the Signpost Uncommon. It tells you everything you need to know. It mills you. It likes it when you cast things from your graveyard. And it has Disturb itself coming back as a 3/1 flyer. And so this deck can really make spot removal look terrible because things just keep coming back from the graveyard. It can also grind out some value by sacrificing cheap things that have Disturb. And it can also mill itself and take advantage of Disturb and Flashback. It's not as into milling itself as another color pair we're going to see in a little bit, but it does like to do it to some extent. Mostly, though, you just sort of, play a blue-white deck, and you're going to end up with a bunch of Disturb, and you're going to be able to outcard your opponent and kill them with a bunch of flyers in the air. And it's another deck that comes together really easy. I think the key common here, probably Bait Hook Angler. It is pretty good in basically any deck, but this deck can get the most value out of it thanks to all of its Disturb payoffs and, Spirit payoffs and stuff like that. So Bait Hook Angler is really good. It gives you a 2-for-1 frequently. Sometimes it only lets you trade for one thing, but then you have a 1/2 flyer the rest of the game, and that's okay too. All right, so now we move into our second tier. Here I have things sort of organized in order, but I could see shuffling these around a fair bit. This second tier is all decks that are pretty good. Decks that, especially when they're, relatively open, can come together really effectively. And I have 6 color pairs in this sort of middle category. And I think the best of this second tier is the black-white deck. The Signpost Uncommon here is Flesh Taker. It's about sacrificing stuff. It's about stuff dying. And the key common here is Unruly Mob. not really that good in any other deck, but in this deck it can get big in a hurry. So the plan here is you can take advantage of black cards that make zombie tokens and sack them to things like Flesh Taker. And you can also just, have things die and generate value out of it with things like Unruly Mob and other cards. Next up, there's blue-green self-mill, and this is one I kind of go back and forth on. Sometimes I feel like it should be in the top tier even. Sometimes I feel more like it should be in the middle of the second tier, but it's a pretty cool deck. It might be my favorite one to play in the format. And it's all about milling yourself and taking advantage of both Flashback and Disturb. The signpost in common here is Root Coil Creeper, a creature that can give you mana, which is nice, gives you good fixing, but then it gives you even more mana to cast things from your graveyard, and it can even bring back a flashback card, which is pretty sweet. And yeah, the main idea here is to mill yourself and to take advantage of stuff with flashback and disturb. Those effectively become cards in your hand while you're milling yourself in this deck, and that's pretty sweet. And the key common here, Eccentric Farmer, if you've been playing this format, you know that this card has been pretty impressive. I didn't think it was going to be that great. And honestly, this is one that I missed a little bit, archetype-wise in my archetype guide, blue-green self-mill. I said it was blue-green flashback, and it is, but it's also, there's just a lot of commons and uncommons that mill you in blue and green, like Eccentric Farmer, that really set things up for you going forward. And another cool thing about the Farmer is you can sort of use it as fixing. Sometimes you get 3 or 4 of them, and that's plenty of fixing to splash a thing, and that's pretty cool because it's going to help you find your lands faster, and then you can just get them back whenever. But yeah, blue-green self-mill, it's all about milling yourself and getting value out of it. Next in this tier, I have blue-red spells. Signpost uncommon here is Storm Skrillex, reduces the cost of instants and sorceries, and gets bigger when you cast an instant or sorcery. We see this archetype a lot. It's pretty good in this format, blue-red spells is. It is a little more reliant on uncommons, in particular, the one that makes you a creature token equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard, or with flashback that have been exiled, that then has flashback. Like, that is the big, most exciting win condition for the deck. But, Storm Skrillex can do it too. Also an uncommon, unfortunately. So this deck is a little harder to make come together than some of the others, but it does have a lot of synergy at common and uncommon. And I think the key common here is probably Ardent Elementalist. This is, gives you a 2-for-1 most of the time, lets you rebuy a removal spell. And this deck has a lot of good spells to rebuy. Next up, I have the black-red deck, which is sort of a vampire deck and sort of a bloodthirst deck. The signpost uncommon is Vampire Socialite, which really tells you both of those things. It likes it when when your opponent's been damaged, and it likes vampires. And this deck is an aggro deck that does stuff with vampires, wants to make sure to chip in for damage to get extra value. And, for the key common here, I thought of a few different ones, but in the end, I ended up on Famished Foragers, this 4-mana 4/3 that gives you 3 red mana when you cast it if you have damaged your opponent. And that frequently lets you double spell. Like, there are some insane curve outs in this format where you play, basically any 2-drop, any 3-drop, attack your opponent on turn 4. Maybe they trade with one thing and take the other, or maybe they just don't block. And then you play your Foragers, and then you play another spell. And it's just not that hard to double spell. And I really like that even in a fail case, you can rummage, throw away a card and draw a new one with the mana you make. And you don't always get to make the mana, but this deck is pretty good at chipping in for damage early. It has lots of cheap creatures that can do the job. And so I've been pretty happy with Famished Foragers in this deck. Next up, I've got green-white. This is a color pair mostly about Coven. It's basically an aggro deck. It's interested in going wide, so, that's a theme. Dawnheart Wardens tells you both of those things. It both pumps your whole board and has a Coven ability, and when you get it going, it can be pretty spicy. Getting Coven going, not really that hard in this color pair. They made sure there's lots of ways you can play, like, one card that gets Coven going for you, or close to just one card, depending on the board state. And one example of this is the key common I have for green-white, and that's Clarion Cathar. Gives you a 3/3, gives you a 1/1. You just need one other thing, and you have Coven. Plus, it helps you go wide at the same time, so it's really at its best in this deck. Next up, we've got red-white aggro. So I have this one at the bottom of the tier here because this format mostly is one about synergy. So I have it at the bottom of this tier because it's really not that synergistic. It's just sort of an aggro deck. The signpost uncommon, Sunrise Cavalier, which would have you believe that the deck is about night and day. And there's a minor theme of that for sure, but it's not really a big part of the deck. It's mostly just an aggro deck. And, Sunrise Cavalier is a great, efficient, aggressive creature who gets bigger, and that's great. And, you know, you don't necessarily need synergy. If this deck is open, you can just run people over while they're playing zombies that can't block and stuff like that. And I think the key common here, this is another one where, you know, because there's not that much synergy, coming up with a key common here is a little tricky, but I think Gavany's Silversmith is where I ended up. This is also good in the Coven deck because it can set up Coven for you by putting counters on things. But it's also good here, you know, if you play 2-drop, 3-drop Silversmith, that's a pretty good curve out, and it can be all commons. And it's a pretty good curve out that is pretty powerful in this deck. And now we move into the final tier, which has 2 color pairs in it. These are both color pairs that are very hard to make come together into sort of synergistic, powerful decks. It can happen, but you're usually very reliant on uncommons and rares, and that's what makes them the worst color pairs. Like, on average, if you draft these 2 color pairs, they're just going to be worse than the other ones we've talked about, unless certain things line up for you, and that's just how it is. And one of these, the 9th best archetype, I guess, second to last best, is red-green werewolves, which is weird. This is a werewolf set. But the main problem here is that there's not really any synergy, or there's very little. It's all an uncommon. You know, yes, there's like the flash aura and the threaten effect that pay you off for, you know, having a werewolf or whatever. But both of those cards are pretty mediocre or worse. So that's really what the problem is. The 2 common payoffs for this deck aren't that good. And so you're really reliant on hitting uncommon ones. And you know, the signpost uncommon here, by the way, is Kessig Naturalist, who is one of these great payoffs for the werewolf deck. You know, just an efficient creature on the front, gives you some extra mana. Then on the back, it's a werewolf lord, which is great because you're going to have a lot of werewolves in red-green. But it's an uncommon, you know, and there are a couple of other uncommons that give you werewolf payoffs, like the, you know, 3 mana 3/3 that puts counters on things, and then when it transforms, gives trample to your whole board. Not your whole board, but all your werewolves. And then there's also Village Watch, the one that gives haste, but it's so, like, they needed to make this cost 1 less mana, and it would be so much better. It's so unimpressive for the most part. So yeah, you're really reliant on rares and uncommons. You know, the idea is you play a bunch of werewolves and you have payoffs for them. Problem is, getting those payoffs isn't easy. That said, some people are avoiding this color pair like it's the plague, and I've had drafts where I end up with 2 or 3 of basically all the good uncommon werewolves, and that deck's pretty good. It's going to be, the uncommon werewolves are all really good, and they really power up the deck if you can get them. Problem is, they're uncommon, and there's no guarantee you're going to get them, so, you know, that's what makes it a weaker color pair. And I think the worst of these color pairs is black-green. It's sort of a morbid deck. It likes when things die. Grizzly Ghoul is the signpost uncommon here. It shows you that. But it just, you know, it's kind of into self-milling. It's kind of into filling the graveyard. But just like the red-green deck, there's not really any major payoffs for doing this stuff at common. Like, there's really not much around to take advantage of. Yeah, you know, if you attack with zombie tokens, those trigger things, you know, the decay tokens, and that's true, but there's not really any payoff for doing that at common. You really have to go into higher rarities, and basically these 2 bottom tier decks, you know, they just have a very hard time coming together with synergy, and synergy is what makes a lot of the decks in this format, basically all of them that aren't red-white, synergy is what makes them all powerful, and they can just overpower these decks on average. Again, black-green's crazy open. You're going to end up with a pretty good deck. I do think, you know, if, you know, all things being equal, if all of these color pairs are crazy open, black-green's still going to be the worst deck of the 10. But it can come together in the right draft. But overall, it's a pretty underwhelming deck. So those are my rankings of the 10 archetypes of Innistrad Midnight Hunt. All right, so as usual, we'll close out this edition of Nizzanotes with a crack-a-pack, where I, you know, show you a pack, a theoretical pack one, pick one scenario, talk about the cards in it, and tell you which one I would pick. All right, so here's our pack. Our first common is Harvest-Tide Infiltrator, 3 mana, 3/2 with trample, transforms into a 4/4 trample. You know, you'll play it in a lot of decks, especially the red-green deck when it's open. But it's nothing special, certainly not something you want to first pick. Diregraph Horde, however, it's one of the best commons in the set. This card's just crazy. It gives you 3 bodies, you know, for 5 mana. And it even lets you hate on your opponent's graveyard, because, you know, why not? It does a ton. It wouldn't be surprising for it to be an uncommon in terms of its power level. It's great in the blue-black deck. That's like really where it's insane. But it's good in every black deck in the format. It's good, period. And so it is something you end up first picking in this format reasonably often. So, if this pack doesn't have good uncommons or rares, Diagraph Horde would be a nice pick. Next up, we've got Ritual Guardian, 3 mana, 3/2 with Covenant gets lifelink. It's fine. It's a card you'll play, especially in green-white, but, you don't want to take it this early. Search Party Captain is a little better. Going into the format, I was really pumped about this card. The idea that it would draw me a card and sometimes cost 2 or 3. And that's still true. But going into the format, I think I probably would have taken Search Party Captain over the Horde, which now seems insane, and it's certainly not what I would do now. I do think it's a card you can first pick in some weaker packs, but it's definitely the Horde here. Next up, we've got Bat Whisperer. Okay creature, especially in black-red, gives you a bat token. It's nice that that token has flying and can sort of set up future triggers for your other cards that care about you damaging your opponent. But it's not great. When you can't trigger it, it's horrible, actually. So it's definitely not something you take early. It's really something you can wait to take for a while in most packs. Neonate's Rush. This is a nice little card. It looks like it's a vampire card, and it is. But I actually think it's even better in blue-red because it triggers all your spell stuff, and it's a cantrip. And, when you can kill something with Neonate's Rush, it feels incredible. And it's good in the vampire deck, but like I said, I think it's even better in blue-red. Still definitely Diagraph Horde, though. It's better than all of these. Revenge of the Drowned has been pretty nice. It time ebbs a creature into your opponent's library, and you get a zombie token. It's one of these effects where you're like, hey, look, I get a free zombie on an already playable card, and then you can do some sweet stuff with that zombie in a lot of the decks in the format, but especially blue-black. That said, it's still definitely Diagraph Horde. Thraben Exorcism, basically unplayable in your main deck. Don't do it. If you're playing best of 3, it's not a bad sideboard card. Bramble Armor, it's okay, especially if you're in an aggressive green deck. It can also sort of help you get Coven because you can equip it to things, but it's nothing special. Certainly not thing you take remotely early. Same thing with Bounding Wolf. If you're in green, you do often need reach, especially if you're in like red-green, and Bounding Wolf can do the job, but you end up not playing it more than you play it, I would say, in this format. Okay, Cathartic Pyre. So this is a powerful removal spell, can do 3 to a thing, and it lets you rummage twice if you want. This is an interesting pick because, on day 1 of this format, it would have easily been Cathartic Pyre over Diagraph Horde. But I gotta say, looking at this pack right now, I think I'd take the Horde over it. That's just how good the Horde is in this format. The Pyre is a nice card, but in a lot of ways, it's, as you can get more mediocre removal later in the draft that is closer in value to Cathartic Pyre than you can get a creature later in the draft on the same power level as Diagraph Horde. And the synergy the Horde gives you is great. It's definitely close. I could see it going either way, but right now, I'd say Diagraph Horde. Moonsilver Key, this is, if you need fixing, it's an all right thing to have around. Apart from that, you don't really run it, so that definitely means you don't take it early. Unnatural Moonrise, it's a signpost uncommon for red-green. For each of the color pairs, I should have mentioned, this is the downside of not actually scripting things. I should have mentioned for each of the color pairs, they do all have 2 signpost uncommons, but each one has one that's like signpostier, you know what I mean? And so, it's the werewolf guy that we talked about, but Unnatural Moonrise also makes it night immediately, transforms all your werewolves, and can draw you some cards, and it's a fine card if you're in red-green, but definitely not something you first pick. And then our rare is an insane one, and it is something we definitely take over Diagraph Horde, and that's Brutal Cathar. If it's daytime, it comes down and exiles a thing right away. If it's nighttime, it comes down as a larger creature who has ward, who doesn't exile something right away, but when it transforms back into Brutal Cathar, when it turns to daytime, it can exile things again. And if you can go back and forth with it, you can end up exiling multiple things, and it can just take over games. It's insane. It's a bomb. And we would take Brutal Cathar, and I think it would go Brutal Cathar, Diagraph Horde, Cathartic Pyre in that order. Cathartic Pyre and the Horde I could definitely see flipping depending on, what you're interested in this format. But right now, that's the pick order for me in this particular pack. All right, so that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it with your friends. If you want to make sure you see future episodes of this series, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on my other thoughts about the format, including my archetype guide, set review, earlier episodes of Nizzanotes, you should see playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to support the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.